Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Chris Hattingh. Chris, how are you doing?
Hi, Nick. Doing well, thanks. Looking forward to finding out what's happening with the latest palace coup in the UK. So I think that's high on our agenda.
Oh, we'll get to that. But first, we are also joined today by Mr. Hermann Pretorius. Hermann, how are you?
I am.
No, I know exactly how you feel. There's something about this weather of sitting on the edge of a rainstorm, because I haven't been rained on yet. I know some parts of Hattingh have been. And it feels like an inner pressure cooker. I don't know what it is, but it is so hideously unpleasant. Also, I need to deal with bureaucracy this week twice, so I'm not in a good mood just because of that. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Let's get on to our first story. Oh yeah, go ahead, Hermann.
What also added to this feeling of just barely being is over the last week, the area where I live have had power outages for 48-hour stretches and stuff like that, and it's immensely frustrating. But what's almost more frustrating than that, it gives it stiff competition, is members of the community essentially demanding from our local councillor to fix everything, to just have a mini little coup in this part of Pretoria, get all the taxes together, get all the revenue, and just ward councillor, why did my cat have a sore paw yesterday, or where's the spanners?
When I was a ward councillor, I was harassed continuously by a guy who believed that all the money collected in the ward in the form of tax should be spent only on the ward in tax, which is, on a certain sort of, as a proponent of federalism, I can appreciate that to some degree, but also you're going to have to change, I think, basically the constitution to get that done there, Chief. But anyway.
It's a great idea, but the problem is, if you actually go look at the competencies and the capabilities and the functions of a ward councillor, they're slightly in usefulness to government above a Tamagotchi. They are useful in the sense that they're an emotional release in the sense, but literally looking at their functions, they are a link of communication from the city to the people and the people to the city, and that's essentially it.
Yes. No, but Hermann, you give me PTSD. Anyway, let's talk about our first story here, and this is. Well, we're back in load shedding again, so it might as well be a good enough time as any. Or did we ever leave? I'm not quite sure. I think there was a day or two in the middle there where we left it. But about that fair state-owned enterprise, that dear thing close to all of our hearts, Eskom. So a report has come out which suggests that between 2007 and 2021, Eskom invested 680 billion rand, which is a fair chunk of change, to increase its generation capacity to avoid load shedding. However, despite this huge investment, Eskom managed to produce less power by the end of the expenditure period than it had before it. So obviously, load shedding really started in a very big way back in 2007. And the huge Medupi and Kusile coal power stations were planned immediately as an attempt to fix this problem. And on a basic level, that sounds great. Everyone started planning for the future. We said, we're in trouble. We need to build some power plants. Well, we built these huge power plants, but they have so many problems that they haven't really been worth it. What's even worse is that if you compare the levels of efficiency, so Eskom reached its peak efficiency somewhere around 1999-2000, when it produced 58 gigawatts of electricity for every 1 million rand spent at its in that period. However, by the year 2022, Eskom only generates 8.7 gigawatts per hour per 1 million rand spent on capital expansions, which is quite a drop in efficiency. So I think, Hermann, let me start with you. This is a recurring problem. I think we see across all levels of government. On Saturday, there's a Daily Friend piece that I've written, dailyfriend.co.za, which is just making a similar point about how we spend a lot of money on IT systems for government, but they really don't get anything out of it. And I think bang for buck is one of South Africa's biggest problems. And it's the kind of problem that you can't fix by just allocating more money. It's the kind of problem you have to fix with management. What's your take on all of this?
No, I mean, that's absolutely right. The thing is bang for buck or fang for... Never mind. The point is that we are in a situation where the inefficiencies have crept in at so many levels that it is essentially endemic. If you look at the very top issue of just the running of Eskom power generation facilities, we spent literally billions of rands on power stations that have inflated costs because of things like preferential procurement, cadre deployment, BEE, and some of these things quite blatant in terms of preferential procurement, but other things like BEE making this bang for buck, at least with the construction of basic infrastructure, quite something impossible to get positive ROI on. I spoke to someone the other day who has a rather specialized ceramics business where they manufacture ceramic tiles and coatings and so on of a very specific, almost space age quality for the insides of some turbines, ovens, those sorts of things involved in power generation. Up until roughly 2019, this person made a lot of money. It's a very specialized thing they do. It's a very worthwhile service they do. And up until about 2019, they were getting, the business directly. They were doing business directly with Eskom. But then in 2019, the procurement process changed. And this guy thought, my business is going to take a massive knock. I'm probably going to have to, make some serious readjustments, look globally for opportunities. But lo and behold, the only thing that happened was that the preferential procurement put in a middleman that had necessary BEE and preferential procurement criteria that met that threshold. So instead of this gentleman getting the contract directly from Eskom, this gentleman would now be subcontracted by the person who got the contract from Eskom. And the magic bit is this person with a ceramics business ended up doing exactly the same in terms of turnover and profit. So essentially, all the middleman did was take a cut through satisfying BEE and preferential procurement criteria. That's it. No efficiency was actually achieved there, just a political elite, a cadre somewhere well connected, got a useful little transfer role of getting millions of dosh from Eskom, giving some of it to this company and keeping the rest. So you've got inefficiencies at that very basic level, but then you also have the constant political interference and, let's be honest, ANC factional very good odds of sabotage. I mean, where in the world do you hear of 5 stations failing at the same time overnight? So it's just everywhere, from the infrastructure to the hiring to the spending to the revenue generation and gathering from places like Soweto that we know have had immensely beneficial payment, leeway given to them for electricity. At every single level where a decision can be made at Eskom, corruption and inefficiencies through cadre deployment, BEE, preferential procurement, and good old state political involvement and corruption have made this bang for buck situation impossible to achieve positive ROI. And the last thing on this, 3 years ago, I was working on a report about Eskom, and I can't remember the exact figures, but the staff contingency of Eskom increased by thousands, and yet electricity and productivity output stayed the same, or in some respects even dipped. So, I mean, you must be really uniquely incompetent to make a loss and such a total cluster copulation of a state monopoly on something like electricity. I mean, if it was a state monopoly on, I don't know, candle manufacturing, if you sort of mess it up, that's you're not massively, the demand for candles isn't universal. But this is a utility so central to modern day life that it's incredible that they've managed to, on every single level of decision making and management, this rot has crept in, and to root it out, I don't know, Chris might have some ideas on that.
I saw the article today with the headline, and I'm paraphrasing uncharitably here, but of Antti Potseca saying, no, students can't be exempted from load shedding, so if you have load shedding, you must suck it up and deal with it. Which, considering our country's education system's performance, yet another great example, and that's a story for another day, of very low bang for buck. We've spent quite a lot of money on education, but we don't really get good results for it. Chris, how do we get out of this mess? What are your thoughts on this problem?
Well, that dreaded P word is probably the best place to start. When I was on Newsroom Africa on Thursday, and the other guest was Caleb Kachalia from the Democratic Alliance, he called for the privatization of Transnet. So he's also pursuing that line. And we talked quite a bit about systems and incentives and failure points. So if you have a state enforced monopoly, you increase the incentive that if things go badly, it affects the whole economy. So this isn't to say that privatization or the private sector would be a panacea. There will still be wastage. There will I strongly suspect there will still be corruption and other inefficiency and that sort of thing.
And
but you just decrease the risk.
I mean, you can look at any of South Africa's big corporates and you will still see, while much more efficient than government, they still have their fair share of incompetence.
Yes. No, absolutely. So with Eskom and their declining electricity output, there's no strong incentive for them to deliver better service to customers. And ultimately, taxpayers, ratepayers are customers. But because Eskom gets bailout after bailout, they're fine regardless. So you've seen the decline of output, but there hasn't been an actual measurable way to see who's being held to account, what's being changed. There's boards changing. There's all this sort of stuff. I wrote an article about the new Eskom board 2 weeks ago, and just nothing fundamentally has changed. It's still the ideology that Eskom must be in charge of electricity production, have the monopoly in terms of that in the country. So you can move deck chairs around the Titanic, but it won't solve anything fundamentally. Same thing. Sorry, Hermann, just the last sentence on Transnet as well with the strike now. When it fails so badly and when things happen, it affects the whole economy and everyone up and down value chains and supply chain. So if you don't have some measure of competition, there's no real incentive for anyone in the organization to change.
And something, sorry, Chris mentioning the deck chairs of the Titanic is actually a very neat way of looking at this. We free marketeers, I mean, I'm not a free marketeer because I think businesses and corporates are just spectacular and wonderful. I mean, just go read Adam Smith. He had an immensely low view of the business doing classes. But if you look at the something like the Titanic, what was it that made the Titanic quote unquote unsinkable? It was these 6 chambers within its hull that you needed actually, if 1 is punctured, the ship is fine. If 2 are punctured, the ship is fine. 3, ship is fine. But 4, then you get to a point of the ship sinking. That's a similar principle that you apply to the free market. It has isolated failure points. So if you have a monopoly, you have no subsections in the hull, then the slightest piercing of the hull at any point of the system will flood the entire thing. The point of the free market is its ability to isolate failure. And sometimes that, of course, gets out of hand. I'm not a complete laissez-faire free marketeer, but you have to look at, a compare and contrast situation here where do you want universal failure with the possibility of universal delivery, or do you want fragmented delivery immunized against universal failure? And on a balance of probabilities, the free market, with its problems and with its risks, is just the safer way to go.
Just as a last point here, next time you encounter someone who proposes these race nationalist ideas like B or any of these kind of keeping Eskom afloat or whatever, just remember that our government, by pursuing these policies, has prioritized a small group of politically connected people over black business owners and black workers who are losing their livelihoods as we speak because of Eskom's complete disaster. So never let them claim the moral high ground over you, because this is a disaster. Anyway, let's go on to our next topic. Good news. Inflation is slowing. Bad news, it's not by that much. But anyway, it's still better than it rising more. So this is the second month in a row that inflation has slowed down slightly. However, the South African Reserve Bank has said that until it sees a much more sustained drop in inflation, it's not going to lower rates. In fact, it may even continue to push them up. There was still increase amongst some of the most important items, namely, I think, food and fuel. But there are also some good signs that things maybe kind of have reached a peak. I don't know. Chris, I'd like your thoughts on it. And also us compared to the rest of the world. I saw the UK has had some terrible inflation numbers now, inflation of 10.1% or something like that. And the US is also having a bad time. So firstly, is it slowing? And secondly, compared to the rest of the world, are we doing okay?
I don't think it's slowing as yet, and my reason for that is that many of the blockage points haven't been resolved to a sufficient degree. So energy, for example, those getting other sources of energy for places like Europe, that hasn't been done to a sufficient degree. I think that'll mean that they'll lessen that pressure, and that has a knock-on effect on us. So we can't import maybe as much oil as we did before, or that sort of thing makes it more costly for us to import goods, because again, we've gutted our own manufacturing industry. We're relying more on imported goods, and again, that feeds into higher inflation in South Africa. So in terms of those points you talked about that have increased, I mean, food and non-alcoholic beverages, that increased by 11.9% year on year, and housing by 4.2%, transport by 17.9%. So just for South Africans who have to rely on public transport, taxis, fuel, they're really feeling it in terms of how much they can spend and maybe where they need to cut. So I don't think we've reached that peak inflation. Maybe listen to the White House for an alternative viewpoint if you prefer some other interpretations. And I think South Africa is going to have to deal with this for at least the next year with continued rate hikes. I listened to Governor Kanyako of the Reserve Bank on ENCA yesterday. And obviously, he doesn't speak for the whole Monetary Policy Committee. He's one of 5 members, but he said he thinks until we get it to inflation below 5%, at least around 4.5%, rate hikes will continue up until that point. And just a final thought, the focus is a lot on rate hikes as a measure to combat inflation. That's the monetary policy side. But I don't think we spend nearly enough time, or policymakers don't, and in government, on reforming supply side issues. So those trade barriers on imported goods, more energy supply, those all feed into high inflation. And at the moment, we're just saying, let's just combat it by increasing rate hikes, by imposing more rate hikes. I don't think that goes nearly
avoiding
far enough to combat
devastating strikes at ports, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that'll now mean that you pay more to import your stuff through the port. So what are you going to do? You're going to pass that cost on to consumers. What does it mean for us? Fundamentally, it means higher costs, because businesses have higher costs to deal with. So if you haven't already felt yourself tightening your belt due to global forces, you're going to feel that definitely over the next 12 months.
Herman, your take on the inflation problem?
Yeah, no, I mean, Chris is absolutely right, and he's very much more the expert on these matters than I am. But something that is quite interesting to look at a political point of view is, in South Africa, we've got monetary policy being relatively reliable, relatively credible, relatively stable, and it's almost with fiscal policy being sort of the opposite. And it's actually very similar to what happened in the UK just now, with fiscal policy being either catastrophically framed or catastrophically communicated, with the Bank of England, their equivalent of the Reserve Bank, having to step in to stabilize through monetary stimulation and monetary control, the total decimation of trust in the economic system of the country. And this is, I think, part of why the expose that cabinet ministers have all these, exempt from load shedding, exempt from water shortages, with the benefits that accrues to them for not having to pay for these things. I think that's part of why it struck such a chord, and why those stories must increasingly be pressurized and promoted, especially by political opponents of the ANC, because the cost of living crisis is very much here. And if you could illustrate that your concern genuinely, as you pointed out at the end of the previous discussion topic, Nick, if you can point out as a political opponent of the ANC, look, you as the ordinary South African citizen, you are feeling these effects, but just look at this political elite. And framing the discussion on almost every single issue through that light would bring illumination to a lot of issues. And I would encourage people to read Molesin Mbeki's Architects of Poverty, 2009, an oldie but a goodie, in which he essentially makes this point, that you've got this rent-seeking political elite class at the very top, and almost every single area of policy benefits them. Whether it's a form of gatekeeping, whether it's a form of rent-seeking, whether it is a form of blatant immunization against the failures of your own policies, it really genuinely is time for South Africans to realize it's not the foreigners, it's not the blacks, it's not the whites, it's not the Indians. It genuinely is the political elite that have driven these divisions and that benefit disproportionately at a cost to everyone else.
All right, let's I think you almost provided a great segue there, but then you moved it onwards to talk about, we're going to go overseas now and talk about what has been one of the most spectacular political implosions I think I have ever seen before. Someone described it as, how when a politician comes into office, they often have a honeymoon period, they get a bounce in their approval ratings. This happens to everyone. Even Trump got this as well, despite the hostile environment against him. Liz Truss, the Prime Minister of the UK, managed to get the reverse bounce, which is that she came into office and got much less popular very quickly. So some of the polls that have been done recently on this show that about 8 out of 10 people in Britain now disapprove of the government, which is some of the highest ever recorded. Even 70-something% of Conservative voters, which is Liz Truss's party, disapprove of the government, and only about 20% approve. There's been some polling of how an election might play out today. The Conservatives, who in 2019 managed to score 44% of the vote and win 365 seats, are projected in some polls today to get only 24% of the vote and a shockingly low number of 18 seats, which would make them, or 18 or somewhere between 18 and 48 seats, which would make them smaller than the Scottish National Party, and therefore no longer the official opposition. I think for the first time, ever. Since like the Whigs, maybe. I don't know. Man, so there's a lot. I think there's a lot to unpack here. I think this says something about the UK that, what Liz Truss is. I know, Hermann, that you had some positive things to say about its her economic program here that caused a lot of this fuss. Still, to me, I think there's something healthy in the fact that when one of the things being proposed was a, as of yet to be funded, tax cut, and when people saw that this might cause a deficit, that it provoked a strong public backlash. I mean, if the Americans had that, the American government would be very different to how it is. It wouldn't just spend money like it does. I think the Brits have shown that they are in some ways more responsible. But Hermann, can you unpack the story a little bit of what exactly happened here?
Yes. So one has to go back to the Conservative Party leadership election, where you had Rishi Sunak, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, very much pushing fiscal conservatism, this idea of fiscal prudence, fiscal restraint, necessitating the maintenance of high tax rate, possible tax increases, to compensate for the massive state spending that occurred in 2020 and 2021 with, amongst other things, the furlough scheme, where government essentially took over the salaries of vast swathes of the economy. So with that sudden expansion of government spending and incurring debt, something that I think most people could genuinely get behind, there's always this question of government borrowing and government spending is in a permanent tension. And sometimes I think there is a justifiable cause to increase borrowing now to pay it down later, because if you don't take drastic measures now, there might not be an economic later. So I think there was a broad global consensus that, irrespective of the merit of lockdown arguments, they were quite clearly, I think, spurious and silly, but that not being the point, there was broad consensus that the government had to step in with massive spending, and that was quite popular because it literally saved businesses and jobs, with a clear understanding that at a later point in time, the money spent now must be re-earned by the fiscus, by Treasury, by the Exchequer, essentially. So that was Sunak's line. Truss's line was very much in the direction of tax cuts. Now, there's a very interesting thing, because Thatcher, the dominant figure still in conservative politics, had struck actually a very good balance between fiscal prudence and reduced tax burdens, so that the private sector can function and sort of the money can flow more productively rather than just government spending. But the problem is that you essentially had Liz Truss taking the tax-cutting idea of Thatcherism and Rishi Sunak taking the fiscal prudence idea of Thatcherism and competing those two against each other, when that is the worst thing that could possibly happen. Because at the end of the day, you had a situation where you had to choose between recession and inflation. Because either you have recession, in which case you keep the money supply going to government, or the revenue supply going to government quite high, reducing and limiting the possible economic productivity that can happen, leading to a slowdown in the economy, or you have the chaos of suddenly an influx of more money into an already inflationary environment that across the board tax cuts would have necessitated. But the beautiful thing is that when Liz Truss came to power on the promise of tax cuts, she went beyond what was actually encouraged. And Kwasi Kwarteng, her former Chancellor of the Exchequer, who was Chancellor for I think something like 38 days, he announced in a mini budget vast tax cuts, and word from within the UK political establishment, is that Kwarteng wanted to push some fiscal prudence measures, but that Truss overruled him. It was very much an idea that we can announce the tax cuts now that will sort of be a sugar rush to the economy, and then in a month's time we can bring out the less popular stuff. Now, there's a lot of criticism of economic policy to go around, but the great failure here was political. The fact that Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng weren't able to defend the policy decisions they made, weren't even willing to take the fight, despite promising at the very start to do so, is what really did it for Truss. If memory serves, Margaret Thatcher won 3 elections without ever being markedly popular, but she was respected. And if you announce unpopular, controversial policies even, the voters might not like it, but they will respect you if you stick to your guns. Liz Truss has U-turned on every fundamental aspect that she stood on for the Conservative Party leadership and prime ministership. So now there's no purpose to the Truss premiership. Political failure after political failure has left her in office, but not in power. And word is that there are currently over 100 letters of no confidence by Conservative members of Parliament to the backbench committee chairman, Sir Graham Brady. And just for some context, you need around 50 to trigger a motion of no confidence. We are probably at double that margin. So Truss might go down as the shortest-lived premier in history due to a crisis of completely her own making.
Man, what a wild ride. And yeah, she's. I think the Tories are really going to struggle now because, they just keep changing prime ministers at this point. And I think they're pretty much destined for the backbenches, at least for a while, for the opposition benches at least. But we'll see. As I say, a week is a long time in politics. Chris, very briefly, we don't have a lot of time left. Please make all this.
I can't add any more analysis to, I think, Hermann's excellent summation, but I would like to bring it back locally and give the final word today to one of South Africa's preeminent classical liberals, Melanie Verwoerd, in an opinion piece today at News 24, where she writes, "The survival of this country doesn't lie in the hands of politicians and officials. The private sector, businesses, farmers, and individual citizens can and are making a huge difference." I mean, what better way to give us hope in South Africa?
I'm sure she would be horrified to hear that you called her a classical liberal. Anyway, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you very much for listening. We hope that you enjoyed the show, and we will be back tomorrow on the Daily Print Show. Cheers, everyone.